Went in there, but then when I did my thesis, I did rural development leadership. Did my thesis, I did community economic development. So then I went on, and that's why after I got out, I ended up with the Choctaw community development. So I did do something come out of rural development leadership. And I thank Shirley, and yeah, y'all right.
Good evening.
Good evening.
I grew up on a farm in a place called Baker County. And I grew up at a time when the sheriff, who wanted to be known as Gator, was the ruler. No one could even come into Baker County. If their car didn't have Baker on the tag, you were certainly stopped. And he was known to have killed several individuals. Now I mentioned Baker because the sheriffs during those early years were totally in charge of everything in the county. And I wanted to mention the one before the Gator, the one who probably trained the Gator. His name was Claude Screws. And that, you should remember his name because during the 40s, he lynched a relative of ours by the name of Bobby Hall. Now, that had happened many, many times. But in this case, an all-white federal jury convicted the sheriff, not of murder, but of depriving Bobby Hall of his civil rights. He appealed the conviction all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, where the conviction was overturned, and the justice who wrote the opinion said, in order to find him guilty, he said the appropriate charge was murder, but he wasn't charged with murder. He said, in order to find him guilty, you had to prove that as he was murdering Bobby Hall, he was thinking of depriving him of his civil rights. So the whole issue of proven intent, Screws versus the U.S. government, I'm told that every law student has to study Screws versus the U.S. government. It came from Baker County. So things were particularly rough for us in Baker County. And then, I don't know how many of y'all had to pick cotton and do all the other work on the farm, but I did. And I would talk to the sun a lot of days. My family were big landowners in the area, and we farmed. I would look at the sun and say, you just wait till I get out of high school. I intended to live my life in the North. I thought, looking at people who would come home to visit, they seemed so prosperous. I didn't know they were renting cars to come home. They were splitting birds, and then they go back with a carload of food. But I thought people in the North were free. So I intended to live my life in the North. In fact, during my senior year, as I was preparing to go to college, I didn't even want to apply to a college in the South. Now, the older women would understand this because we kind of found our husbands at school, right? I didn't want to take a chance on getting with someone from the South, and that's why I wanted to go north to school. But you can never say what you'll never do. But let me go back before March. My father and mother had 5 daughters. They kept trying to have a son, and every time it would be another girl. So they had kind of given up on the son. And then suddenly, during the fall of 1964, my mother stayed sick all the time. We were getting a new home. My father had applied for a loan from Farmers Home Administration to try to build a house. He was approved. He wanted a brick home, but they told him a black person couldn't get a loan to build a brick home. And I say that to you because later I became state director of rural development. Housing was no longer under Farmers Home Administration, it was at rural development. So later in life, I ended up directing that program for the federal government in the state of Georgia. But my father was real happy, and you know, he loved us girls. We all had boys' nicknames. I was Bill. You know, he'd tell Bill, go do this, Gus, go do that. He that was his way of having his sons, I guess. But then all of a sudden, my mother was sick, and I didn't know what was wrong. And at school one day, my best friend said to me, she asked me, how is your mom? I said, she doesn't seem to be getting any better. She said, girl, your daddy was at the store yesterday giving out cigars. Your mama's going to have a baby. My father told everybody it was this boy. In fact, in building that new home, he was having a room prepared just for the son. Now, if you had 5 girls, I don't know why you would think maybe you're going to have a son this time, but he was so certain that it was a son. My father didn't live to see my brother's birth. On March the 15th of 1965, this was during my senior year, my father was shot and he later died on March 25th, 1965. He was shot and killed by a white man in the county who was not prosecuted, even though there were 3 witnesses. The witnesses were all black. I made a commitment on the night of my father's death. I felt as the oldest of the children. My mother was 7 months pregnant. I have 4 sisters. I just felt I needed to do something in answer to what happened. And my thoughts went all over the place. You know, our house filled, we had just moved into the new home, had only been, my father lived there 1 week before he was shot. But I went into one of the bedrooms because I just didn't want to be around anyone else. I needed to figure out what to do. My thoughts went all the way from trying to get a gun to go and look for this man. And I can tell you that was, you know, except my training, you know, how every time that church door opened, we were there, you know. So that was one thing getting in the way. And the other one was, one day my father wanted to train all of us to fire a weapon. So he had us out in the yard, and now I'm the oldest. My sisters, from the youngest up, were taking their turns at firing this weapon. When he put it in my hand, all I could do was cry. You know, I just couldn't do it, you know. So I can remember that night, the moon was full, and I was sitting there, you know how they dig the foundation for the house, the amount of dirt was still there. And I remember looking at that and looking at the moon and asking God to help me figure out what to do. And then the thought just entered my head, and I know it was God talking to me. He said, you can give up your dream of living in the north. You can stay in the South and devote your life to working for change. And that's exactly what I did. We started the civil rights movement in Baker County. My husband now, this young SNCC worker, was I teased him because they had been to Terrell County, and we have a Terrell County resident back there. They had been, Albany is, you know, where they started, and Terrell had been to Worth, had been to America, Sumter County, but hadn't come down there to deal with the Gator. And that didn't happen until after my father had been murdered. That summer, the Gator couldn't figure out what happened to us.